Hey y'all, Lossien here. Join me on a quest today as we turn all of this into this. Keyleth's tunic, we're going to start with taking all of the measurements that we need. Once that's done, we're going to make the pattern. Once we have the pattern, we'll sew it into a mock-up. Then we'll try on the mock-up during a fitting, make sure that everything works, and see if there's any alterations, which brings us to the next step, alterations. Once we make the changes to the pattern, we can cut it out of the actual good fabric, and then all that's left, although it's more than just a little bit, is sewing the actual tunic, and then we'll be done. Always make sure you're wearing the correct undergarment that you're going to wear under the actual costume, because it will change the shape of things. So in terms of horizontal measurements, we're going to write these down. We want around the neck, and then in front of the neck from neck point to neck point. We also want around the widest part of the bust, and then the thinnest part of the waist, and the hips is the widest part of the butt. It's lower than you usually think. My hips start up here, but my hip measurement is down here. This is also a good time to get the front bust measurement, which is from side seam across the front to side seam. And then for vertical measurements, we want to measure the neck drop, which I like to do by going from the neck point, figuring out where my neck ends and going across, which is usually the collarbone. I'm also going to take a measurement of my shoulder depth, so from the top of the shoulder, trying to keep the measuring tape straight, down to where the armpit is, just so I have an idea of that. We're also going to take from the neck point to the bust point in the front and in the back. Then we're going to go from the bust point to the waist, from the side, because on me it's shorter, and from the back. These measurements are much easier with someone's help. Then we're going to go from the waist to the hip, from the front, from the side, and from the back. And we're also going to measure from the waist to the knee and just past, because that's how long the side pieces are. To make the tunic, we're going to start by drafting it without the petals on the side. We're going to use the pant pattern to make the petals, and we're also not going to draw all the different colors onto it in the pattern until it's on us as a mock-up. Then we're going to draw where all the lines are so that we know they lay exactly where we want. We're going to use the side with the selvage as the back, and then we're going to use the side that's folded to draft the front on. I like to start with the front. I just find it easier, so that's what we're going to do. So you've got all your measurements. We're also going to build it upside down. We normally start with the waist, but we're actually not going to this time. I'm gonna arbitrarily start about 2 inches lower, and that's going to be where the neck point mark is. So then we're gonna go from the neck point to the bust and mark that, and that's going to be our bust line. So you can put a little B. We're gonna draw lines straight out from the fold here. That's our bust line, that's our neckline. Then we're gonna go bust to waist and at the center front measurement, and that becomes our waist measurement. Then we're gonna go down to our hips and draw that out. This is a long shirt in the front at least. And then we have to figure out how long we want it past the hip or crotch line. Inseam measurement down to your knee, I'm gonna do half of that. So you can label these. I put a B, W for waist, H for hip. And we're just gonna work the shoulders out, make all our marks, then we'll do the same on the bust, the waist, and the hips. So we measured the width of the neck. We're gonna take half that measurement. So that's the inside of the neck. We're also gonna take that shoulder measurement and cut that in half. Now, Keyleth does have an exaggerated shoulder, so I'm going to add 2 inches, because when I hold the measuring tape on my shoulder and go past that shoulder bone by about 2 inches, it looks right to me. So now we've got the shoulder line. Whenever we do a shoulder, we always go up 1/4 inch at the neck and down 1/4 inch at the shoulder point. So we're going to connect those 2 dots and continue that line over until we get the 2 inches over for the actual overhang. Then we want to mark the neck drop. For me, that is 3 inches, and we're going to scoop this around, making sure this right here is a right angle and this is a right angle as well. Then we're going to take half of the front bust measurement, nice and easy. If your fabric doesn't have any stretch whatsoever, you'll want to add just 1/8 to 1/4 inch on your horizontal measurements, just so you can move around a bit more. My mock-up's going to be a little tight, but the actual outfit will be fine. Now the waist, we want 1/4 of the waist measurement. 15 is 7.5. Would put us right there. That is a big difference between the waist and the bust. And it's not going to look right to sew whoop in like that. So this is where we're going to put in a dart. Since this was 10 inches and this is 7.5 inches, if we do 1.5 inch dart in the middle, that will put this at 9 inches, and coming in just 1 inch is actually a lot better. So we've put that out 1.5 inches, which means we have to take it in. So I find the middle point and I go out 3/4 inch on each side, and we draw this line straight up and straight down. Now, because a boob actually curls, we're not going to sew it quite like this, we're going to sew it more on a curve. But again, this is why we're doing a mock-up, to make sure that looks right when we put it on. Okay, and then our hips. Divide our hips by 4. If we make this a straight line, we actually want to come back and give it a bit of a curve, kind of 1/3 of the way down. There is a type of ruler you can get which is called a hip curve that'll do that for you. And then to try and figure out the exact part in the front, I'm not going to. I'm just going to continue this line straight down, and then I will cut the shape of the curve in the front once it's on. So now we're going to do the underarm. That's the last bit that's left. We're going to go up 2 inches, continue this line straight, and that means that from here to here, in terms of height, should be at least your armhole height. Perfect. Mine is a little bigger. That's what you want. Since you want it to be a right angle, you can just make that a right angle and use the corner of the ruler to do that. We're going to draw the original line and then draw the new line, because that's going to be easier to do it. The original line would scoop like this. So it's mostly straight along this part, and then it scoops here. Because we've got this new shoulder point, it has to come out. So we're going to connect it in here. You don't want it to be too thick as it comes down, or it'll crinkle into the arm. Oh, we have to finish this dart. I would say go down about 1/3 again. We can always put it more or less depending on the shape of your body. Now for me, my waist raises as we go towards the side by about 1/2 inch. I'm going to make a slightly new waist mark and just start the hip curve a little earlier. So that's my new waist. Now on to the back. First things first, our shoulder line. Draw that all the way across. And I've drawn this line at least 1 inch or so out so that we have space to put a zipper in or to pin as we're trying it on. Then we're going to do the back neck drop, which is from your neck point to your bust line, and draw that line out so that we have a bust line. Then we're going to use the side measurement for the bust to waist. If all your measurements are the same, congrats, I am jealous. And then we're going to do the hip measurement from the front. Mine are pretty close, so I'm not too worried about there being a huge difference between the front and the back. We're actually not using the whole back of this because we're going to be putting on the petals on top. And we're going to repeat the neck, so we're going to go across half of the neck width. We're also going to mark across half of the shoulder width. And then we're going to mark 2 inches out from that. While we're here, we're going to go up 1/4 of an inch at the neck and down 1/4 of an inch at the shoulder and connect those 2 lines and keep it going to that new shoulder. So the back neck drop is much harder to measure. I usually don't. I just go about 1.5 inches. That's always suited me quite well. When you draw the neck, you want it to be a right angle here at the fold on both sides and a right angle at the neck point, and then you just scoop them together. And then we do our back bust half. Take your full bust measurement and minus your front bust from that. And then our quarter waist measurement. If it's more than 1 inch between these 2 measurements, you'll want to put a dart in like we did on the front to make sure that this seam isn't really weird because it won't fit properly. Then we're going to take the hip measurement. We're not going past the hips on the back. This is a little weird. I would be tempted to move this out and put a dart in so this was a bit better, but I know that the petals on the side come all the way up to the waist, so we probably won't even use this part of the actual tunic. We go up 2 inches here, continue this line, and then we will draw what would have been the armhole. So you can just connect those 2 lines and then scoop them. I feel like that should come in a little bit. And then, so we're gonna connect it in here. There we go. So there's only 1 piece left to cut, and that is the neck. There is a space on the neck in the front of hers, and the back will be where the zipper is. So we need to measure our pattern, and we want to measure along the back neck and record how much that is. And we also want to measure along the front neck and record how much that is. So because I have extra space in the middle, that's where I'm going to do this. I'm going to use a straight line to start. I'm going to start at the front and then swoop up towards the back. So I'm going to give myself a right angle. We're going to measure across the 5 inches. And then I'm also going to measure across the 4 inches that is the back. And here at the very back, I'm going to go up 1/2 inch. Can't remember if it's exactly 1/2 inch, but I prefer things to be a little looser. And then we're going to connect that to the middle part. Now we use another right angle at the end, and that's going to be the back. This is the shoulder, and that's the front. Normally, if the front was connected, we would put this on a fold. Because it's not, we don't have to. So I measured the height as 1.5 is what I wanted my height to be. So I'm going to measure along this line, 1.5, making sure it has that same curve. And then at the very front, we're going to take it in the tiniest amount, because I want just a very small gap, just like that, because that'll actually be double that amount, and it tends to splay a bit when you're wearing it. So all that's left at this point is to add our seam allowance. So if you use a quilting ruler, you can just figure out exactly what line you have to line it up with. I'm doing about 1/2 inch, and I'm going around every seam and adding all of the seam allowance. The only time I would change that is I'm going to do 1 inch on the very back where the zipper is going to be, because I want that extra space. I'm still going to do the normal amount at the bottom here, which I realize means that I should put 1 inch at the back neck here to make it match the back here. And we're going to do the same here. I'm going to add 1 inch to the bottom just in case I did it a little short, which at this point it's probably way too big, but it is easier to take stuff off than to add stuff. And then we can cut this out. As you cut around the waist area, make sure to give yourself a little cut in at the waist, a notch, so that you can match up the front and back. I'll also notch the waist where the zipper goes to make sure that I can line that up as well. And there's the front. But before you think we're done, we still have to figure out the petals. We're not gonna need the crotch part because it's more of a skirt. So that's gonna fold back like that. It's hard to tell exactly how much the gap is. We're gonna start on the back here. I'm gonna go as far down as my fabric allows, which is 5 inches below the knee, because it's much easier to take extra off than it is to add it after. Now, I don't want this dart on the back, so even though I just drew that line, I'm going to fold the dart over itself and redraw that line, pulling the back in. We are keeping this dart here at the waist because there's no way not to have it. I'm going to mark the very bottom of that. And then when we come to the front, we're just going to draw all the way down. So we're basically using the pants pattern as a very rough guide, and mostly for that seam at the waist, the dart. So this is our very messy pattern. Now everything I traced had seam allowance already except for the dart, so we're going to add that back in. And there we go. We're going to do this on a nice big basting stitch, the whole thing. And we're just going to sew down that, what was the crotch seam off the back. Remember to put a pin straight through the bottom of the dart so you can see it on the other side. Mark where those will actually go. The sewing line, just give them a quick notch. Put my other pin here. Pull this along this line and sew it down. And do the same on the other side. And there we go. Now this is extremely rough because it's very hard to try and figure out where these things are going to go before you try it on the body. Now we're going to look at our front tunic. We're going to take a brief moment and notch the very front at the top and at the bottom so we know exactly where that center front is, so we can line things up. This dart is a little trickier than our previous darts. We're going to put a pin at the very top, on the two sides, and at the bottom. And then we're going to flip it over and do the same thing again, although it looks like my marker has bled through. Pins on both sides, and then we're going to open it up. So to do this, these pins or darts are trickier. We're going to fold it between the first two pins. We're going to start at that bottom pin. Remove it before we sew. Make sure that these two pins line up. I stab one through and make sure it comes out at the same side. So that was the easy side. This side is the hard side because it doesn't have the marks on it. Fold it from top to bottom pin, and then in the middle, I like to hold it between my fingers. I stab that pin in again and make sure it comes out where the other pin comes out. If it doesn't, you may have to adjust it slightly until they come out at the same spot, and then you can stick that into the side and take the pin from behind out because that holds it and you know that's your corner. We're going to start at that top pin, pull it out before we sew. You never want to sew over a pin. And now we have darts. Now we're going to take our back pieces. We're going to match it up at the shoulder seams. Okay, you want to make sure that your marks are on the outside on both sides. And we're just going to sew it straight across. And then we'll lay the other shoulder piece down. So the zipper part goes in the middle. And we will sew that straight across. And then you connect underarm to underarm, but more importantly, waist to waist. Those notches should line up, and the waist don't line up. I would make the waist line up first and let the underarm be slightly different. And we're going to do the same on the other side. Okay, so next is the neck. So we want to notch that shoulder point on the neck so we can line that up. And then you place it so that the back goes towards the back and the front goes towards the front. Now you can start at the shoulder point, which is what we're going to do here. Normally when you do shoulders like this, all of your seam allowance goes towards the back. And I'm actually going to fold that seam allowance back so we can see how big the open part at the neck is going to be. We have to do this before the zipper because the zipper goes all the way up. Last step is the zipper. The zipper's the last step till we try it on. So we will use an actual invisible zipper when it's time. This is just to sew it down to get an idea. And it needs to go into the hip a little bit, or else you will not be able to get it on past your butt. So I sew it in a bit from the side because I'm not sewing the zipper tight, so I want to make up for any extra bits. And I'm matching up the waist notch on the zipper while it's closed so I can make sure that the zipper is in the right place side to side, the same place side to side. I sewed the zipper in from the seam allowance that we initially had because I'm leaving quite a bit of the width of the zipper visible. We're not sewing it super tight, so I just sewed that extra bit in so that it equals the same amount at the end in terms of width for fitting. And it looks like the zipper's on inside out, but that's because we're going to try the whole thing on inside out with all the seams where we can see them. So now it's time to try it on and see how it fits. Overall, fits pretty good. Gotta play with it a bit. I think I might want to put a dart in here, take the shoulders down just so they fit a little better, take that in. I've got to take it up, take it in at the back here, and bring a bit more of the dart in here. I just want a better fit across the bust, so we're going to start there. Right at the underbust, like at the underwire line, you put one pin pointing down and one pin pointing up, so you know exactly where that take-in's going to be. And we also are going to have our reference pictures nearby, because we're going to be looking at them a lot on this. Ow, ow, ow. Try to not pin yourself. Take up that waist. I'm not going to pin right where the zipper is, we'll pin just to the side. I have a short waist in the back, so for me this is something I should have seen coming. There we go. So this is like way too high. I'm liking for the most part how the neckline is sitting, but if this were sitting right, I do like how it's sitting. I don't think the collar's sitting quite right, but that's also because I didn't trim all these. So if we kind of floof it up a bit, it sits nicely. Yeah, that's the right amount, I think. Just a little bit. And it's going to be shorter, which hers is perfect. I like a very loose neck, personally. I don't like things tight around the neck. It drives me up the wall. These shoulder doohickeys. There's a lot going on right now. If we fold back the seam allowance, it's a little better, but there's still a lot of extra. So if we take it down, sometimes your shoulder drop is more than you think. That's okay. It's sitting at the right point at the neck and it feels comfortable there. So we're going to draw a new shoulder line with pins. Okay, so that is much better. If I fold it along that new pin line, that actually looks right to me, but it's too far out. So if instead of 2 inches, I'm just looking at the reference picture, it comes out just a bit. Yeah, so if we make the new line there, I'm just going to pin that so we can get an idea visually. Do we want to put just a little dart right here? Yeah, just a very little dart to help take it in the tiniest amount. There we go, and all of a sudden the whole thing is sitting better, you can see. See, now that I see that, I think I want to let it back out to that original mark, now that we have that pinned. Okay, so we'll go between the 2 marks. Petals! Because I want to draw the lines on when everything's on. I'm going to connect it at the side seams, because I want it to go all the way up to the waist on the side seams. Okay, those actually fit pretty well. We're going to give it a little pin here and on the 2 sides, the center, just to hold it in place while we draw all the lines on. I mean, it looks weird. I'm rocking it though. Okay, now we gotta draw all our lines. So we like this as the top. I'm just gonna do this side as our main side. Comes to about there and goes just behind the leg, so that seems right. And it comes in to about there. So it'll come down like that. And it comes back abruptly and then gently to that line down there. Does that look right? Yeah, that's the amount on her body, which means I can repin that. Which means that underneath, we're doing all the front stuff first because I find it easier to work like that. So if that's the crotch, it goes to about there. Yeah, because that comes in just a little bit more, and then that'll continue up, because I do want a bit of stuff underneath there. How far in does that go? About that. It's pretty good. And then this, let's look at that side, comes like right here to about there. That looks right to me. I'm also going to draw so that we know where that lines up. Can have a seam because there's a fabric that goes on it. Hey, we got part of it. Unfortunately, it's the easy part. It's much harder to draw on your own back. So that dips down a bit. Yeah, they're about equal. So that's where it comes from the bottom down. This is the line that should be sewn all the way. And then do need to know where this connects. Okay, we're gonna unpin this side. It gets tricky. Okay, we should be able to meet those up when we're not in it. All right. Time to make some pattern adjustments and then cut it out. First thing I'm gonna do is transfer this line onto the back here. And we're gonna concentrate on the bottom for now. This is an extra piece. This was my stitching line, and then it's gotta come join this. Better, and then swoop down. This is where the connecting piece was. Seam allowance, and this line will have seam allowance until there. And then we have to open up this dart. That was the width we liked. I'm going to draw it so that I visually know. So my plan for this is I'm going to cut this whole shape out of my light green color, and then I'm going to cut a trim to go on top of that. All right, that is ready to cut out in light green. Now we're gonna look at the actual tunic. I'm gonna start by taking the zipper off. And I'm tearing apart, or tearing off the side that we didn't make the marks on. This is the side we want. And we're gonna start with that bust dart. They look about the same, which is good news. So I'm just gonna give it a light draw. There we go, even it out. We're going to want to draw this dart, and that dart should end in line with the other bust dart. Okay, and there was nothing we had to do on the side seam. The neck was fine. Ah, yes, the shoulder. And we want to go half and half. So, I've marked out where the pins were. and we'll draw that as a straight line. I've also marked the new inside. So this part needs new seam allowances because it's come in a bit, but the rest of the pattern is pretty straightforward and didn't really need too many adjustments. Now, there was a seam line on the back that should continue from here that I couldn't draw on myself. So let's make this straight. Actually, I don't mind if it's not quite straight. A little curve, because it's on the body, is fine. But I want to make sure it lines up here. It's all covered by her hair, but as far as I can tell, it's just a scoop. We're gonna curve it up like this. It'll be a flap in front and it'll just connect at the waist in the back. I'm gonna put some new notes. This means cut on fold. This is not. This is cut on fold. And when we get back here, none of these are cut on fold. And then we need some way of color coding. Light versus dark green. Oh look, a light versus dark green. So we're going to add seam allowance here. Now this is actually hem allowance, so we're going to add a full inch because then we can do it properly. This is going to connect to the other skirt. It can just be normal seam allowance. Gonna open up these darts. I'm actually gonna open up both sides. Now, you don't always have to cut it out twice. I'm doing this because I have very little of the dark green, so I'm going to have to be very careful with all of my pattern pieces to make sure that I have the right ones. We have to keep in mind that these seams we're cutting now, these style lines, do not have seam allowance. There we go, we've got one for light and two for dark. And then on the front, that's a dark piece, that's light, and that's dark. Okay, so this is folded in half. If I can leave this for the chunks along the edges, that would be perfect. So it's gonna take some playing to get this to sit as nicely as possible. Literally just playing with it to see if I can get a better... By George, we just might have it. So if that was 1 inch, it would be 2 inches total. The other side. Okay, hey. We're gonna back it with a different color because I do not have enough. Seam allowance. Crap. Forgot about that. Okay. Hey, we remembered before we cut. Make 2-inch strips to go around. And look at that, we do actually have enough to do a second neck, or a second set of necks, I should say. Now it's time to cut out, or the light greens. So because this fabric has a bit of stretch this way but not this way, I want to make sure all my acrosses have the bit of extra stretch to them. Oh, it is not a place on fold, right, because there is a seam here. So let's just face it all the same way, just in case. I think that's going to use the least amount of fabric. Just because I have it doesn't mean I want to use it all up. Now the other thing we do have to do is cut out the armholes facing. What this means is we trace the armhole, mark the seam allowance again, then we trace double that amount because we're going to sew this to finish the armhole. So when you lay it on top of your sleeve, it should fit in the armhole. When we do the one for the front, we're going to actually close that visually, the dart, so that we don't have to put a dart in it. That'll be the armhole facing. And I just put it on top of the piece that it goes with so that we know. And we need to cut out a second set in a dark green because it's lined. If I go on an angle, which you're really not supposed to do, we just made it. So that's the front and back, and the straps along the edges. And then we've got the front, that's the front. And this is the back. And the neck piece. All right, the very last piece is right on the front. There is a different color that goes here and here. We're just gonna cut strips of that. We're gonna make them 1.25 inches. I'm gonna do that off camera. Doo-doo-doo. Now, because there's so many this time, we have 4 layers. We'll do this multiple times, so that gives us 2. So we're going to start by sewing the darts on the lining. We are going to sew up the lining together, not all the way, about halfway. And now we're going to sew the darts on the outer part of the skirt. And because this is stiffer, we're going to take a moment and trim the extra fabric off. So I'm marking it in 1 inch all the way up and in a couple spots because we're going to do 1 inch wide. And we're going to mark it all the way around, just in a couple spots, because this is just our guide. And of course, this is when my camera died, right when we needed to talk about what the next step was. So here we go. I laid down my light green fabric and then put the strip of dark green on top of it so that the good sides were facing together. I used that sketched line as a guide and made sure that just my seam allowance amount on the dark green was on that line towards the outside edge. You can see here that the bulk, like the main part of the dark green fabric, is towards the inside, and then I stitched all the way down that edge until I got to the point where it intersected with the line from the next side. That's where I stopped stitching. I left the extra length of dark green down, so going past the edge of the light green, but I did not stitch it down so that I could actually make a fancy corner and make it look really pretty. I did this on all 3 sides of the leaf piece, and then I repeated it on the other side. I do have the recording of how I did the actual corners, so we'll go through that, but just attaching the dark green to the light green was time consuming, but unfortunately that footage no longer exists. So we've got to do the mitered corner, which is where it looks really nice. And the easiest way of doing that is laying it flat on the one side, marking the angle with a pin, and then drawing it with chalk to make sure you have the right angle. So for the bottom, it's about a 45-degree angle, and we're going straight down to that point where we've sewn both of them. And then we want to trim all the extra seam allowance away and any bits of thread. The bottom's a little trickier. So I've just pinned these together, and we should be able to unfold them and just connect this pin line all the way. And you can always double check. That's great. So now we can trim the extra. And we're going to repeat this on the second one, and then once that's done, we're going to take this to the ironing board and iron it all flat like that. So we'll put that aside for a moment, and the next step, which I've already done and it wasn't recording, is putting the piping on the front. We did not catch the darts, so we do the darts like we normally do, and all I've done afterwards is trimmed all the extra seam allowance from the breast dart that went down. We've done that on both of these. We did darts on the pants and we did darts on the petals, so we do know what's going on there. The next step is to put the piping down. Because we had the 1/2-inch seam allowance, I just sewed it all the way down along the neckline on both pieces, making sure that I took my time and I did not move from that amount so that it was nice and even for the piping. And then I also did the piping down the center front, which is where these two connect. So now that that's done, we're going to lay this one on top of the other. And the big trick with this is we're actually going to stitch on the side where we can see the stitching from the piping. And then we know for sure that we haven't gotten too much of that. So the next step is to press this flat so that it looks nice and purty. And we're gonna put this to the side and do that. But before we do that, our last 2 pieces that we have to do before we can go to the ironing board is we're going to put the piping on the back neck line right here before we add the dark green part. So this is the same thing we've already done, taking our time. This one's a little trickier because it's got that curve. And it got a little wide as we went here, so we're going to start back here again because it does make a little bit of a difference. Cut the extra off, and we'll give that a quick iron when it's time. It's the other neck. Just double checking that we have the correct sides up. We don't actually have to press the back pieces yet, so we can sew the next pieces to them. So we're going to do the top pieces next. They're going to go like that and that. Basically, we're going to match up the shoulder, and then we're going to sew this along that same stitching line we just did for the piping, following along the curve of the dark green as well. There we go. It went a little wonky here because it stretched out as I was going. We're just gonna trim up this way. Correct that. Yeah, that just fixes that. My dark green is a stretchy knit, so I do have to make some changes to accommodate that. And then we're gonna do the same on this one. And that one's much better. Much less of a curve there. Okay. And then we will want to press that in them with the iron. My word's good. But before we do that, we're going to attach this bottom piece because we can. Much like when we did the top, I laid them down underneath to make sure I had each one on the correct side, and then I flipped it so that the good side was to the good side and sewed along that edge with the seam allowance amount. I repeated that for the other side so that when I folded it open, all you saw was the good side on both sides. We are on the last dart. So this actually has an additional 2 spots because that extra under bust dart. By putting the pins straight through, it means we can flip through to the other side where the pins are coming out and stick pins in that side as well, and when we pull open the garment, we will actually see pins sticking out from all of our major dart point. Just like always, then we can fold along the center point of the dart, make sure the pins match up along the edges, pin them through, and then sew the dart. To iron the leaf petal pieces, all I did was push the dark green fabric all the way towards the edge so that it overhang by a seam allowance amount over the light green, and pressed it all the way around. I did this on both pieces to make sure that everything laid the way I wanted it to. On the back pieces of the tunic, I made sure that when I was pressing it, all of the seam allowance was towards the bottom. So this is called a ham, and it's used for when you need to press things on a curve. So we're gonna press this down, because sometimes when you try and lay it flat, there's just too much going on there. But we can get into here, and you can just kind of move it around until you find the curve that you need to iron the part that you want. And we're going to open this middle seam up and lay it flat. This is the tricky one. What we want to do is press this piping flat so that when it touches the top edge, it's even side to side. And these now hit the same spot. Okay, ready for the next step. Back to the sewing machine. Now we're attaching the middle of the front to the bottom of the front. So cut up the 1/2 inch and pin the exact middle. We're gonna start from that center point exactly where that pin is, but not sewing over the pin. Sew up one side, making sure that at the 1/2 inch mark, our darts line up, or as much as possible. That's pretty close. And starting from the center again, work your way out the other side. Trim off the extra. Hey, pretty good. It needs some pressing and then a top stitch, but it's a good place to start. Next thing is attaching this neck piece, which in theory is easy because we have lines to follow about exactly where to start stitching. The trick here is you keep them lined up center to center, get the needle down, then you twist your one side all the way up and follow that line of stitching we already have. And in order to get the other side, you actually want to trim this, not the dark, just the light colors, all the way to that stitching point. Because then what we're going to do is get the needle back in the exact same start point and rotate this the other direction. And then we can cut off this extra. And it just needs a good press. So because it's already laying front, before we press this, we're just going to attach the shoulder seams to the back. And the trick here is making sure that this gold greeny color matches up perfectly, or as perfect as you can get it. So I stab through that stitching line on one layer, and then I go through the stitching line in the same spot on the next layer. And that's pretty close. Things shift a bit when you're sewing, and then we're going to put the other side on. We're going to sew down the side seams just to the waist notch, making sure that all our seam allowance is pressed down by hand. We'll actually use the machine as well. And we're going to do the same on the other side. Okay, and then we're going to take that over to be pressed. We're also going to take a moment to sew the underarm facings. And you take one front and one back, line them up at the bottom, line them up at the top. And then we're going to take these over and press them. And apparently there was a little bit more that my camera died on me and did not get. So with the lining petals and the sewn petals, like the actual good side, I sewed them up halfway up the back so that we could put the zipper in the top edge. Then I laid down the good side facing up towards me, and then took my lining and laid it face down on top of the good side of the petals so that the middle seams matched up and so that the good sides were facing each other. Now the dark green material that was pressed to the side gave me the seam allowance that I needed, and I was able to pin the dark green to the lining material and then stitch all the way around, starting at the front edge, up the back to the center, back down the center, and then up the other front edge. I did not sew any of the very top edge because that will be dealt with later. Then, once that was attached, it was time to press it. So when you press this, you want to make sure that just a little bit of that dark green is showing on the back side. Perfect. So on these, we want to make sure the shoulder seam's going towards the back, and that all the seam allowance with the dark green goes towards the dark green. For the side seam, we are opening up the seam so that it lays flat. And then we're just going to make sure this seam that runs all the way across, all the seam allowance is pressed down. So we're just pressing open the seams on these. Okay, I have switched to a dark green thread, and we are going to top stitch. This just makes sure everything stays laying the same way. We're going to stitch about 1/8 all the way across, making sure that the seam allowance is laying the way we want it to as we go. I'm also going to do all around the neck. For the collar, we're going to put right sides together, and so up the front and all the way around the back. but not down the back. And we want to trim that corner. And same with the other side. We're going to connect that to the neckline. We're going to do this by opening up the collar so we're looking at the right side of the fabric and attach that to the right side of the tunic. And only one side of the collar is getting attached at this point in time. So starting at the shoulder notch, all the way to that stitching line. And out as well, making sure it's only on one side of the collar, and we're only stitching it one side down. And the same on the other side. Before I attached the leaves or petals to the bottom of the outfit, I knew that I actually needed to go back and sew the very front at the top just until the side seam. So the only part not attached to the lining would be from the side seam to the back seam along the top. To do this, I turned it inside out again, so I was looking at all of the seam allowances, and matched up the lining along the top seam and sewed it all the way so that the two side seams, where the dart was lined up. Once that was done, I took a moment to trim the seam allowance so it was shorter, and then clip a notch right at that dart at the side seam so that I could flip some of the seam allowance in and some of the seam allowance out. I did this on both sides of the leaf piece. Now we just have to attach this to the body. Okay, so we actually want this side, because it's going to end up like that. Once I knew exactly which side it was going to attach to, I flipped it up so it was right side to right side, making sure that my zipper spot on the actual tunic lined up with that zipper spot on the bottom, the center back line. I pinned that together and actually started from the side seam and sewed towards the center back, or where that zipper was going to end up being. Then we're going to lay the front down, lay the back down to make sure it matches up. Cool. We're going to be using an invisible zipper like we did on the pants so that we can't see it when it's all done up. This requires an invisible zipper foot. Come on. This is the foot I currently have that I bought specifically for my machine. It's 2 slots to either side with channels in them. It forces the teeth of the zipper over. If you don't have something like that, you probably have something much like this that came with my machine. This is a much broader foot, but it still has like a channel on either side that you can use to force the teeth over, and it still gives you a small section to sew right at the bottom there, right close to the teeth. I'm going to use the one specifically for invisible zippers, but you can use something like this, and I have in the past. So I did try this on briefly earlier, and this is my line of where I want the zipper to end up because I had to take it in a bit towards the waist because I used a stretch material. And my zipper's not going to be long enough, and I can't get a longer zipper. That becomes a bit of an issue. So my solution is going to be to put snaps, and I'm going to put them at the top because they will be hidden by the hair. So the bottom will remain with the zipper all the way down. Eventually we want the zipper to look like this, where you can't see the teeth at all. The teeth go underneath. So if that's how I want it to end up, that means that I'm going to sew it starting at the bottom like this. And we're going to sew on this side where all the extra seam allowance is. Starting with a basting stitch, and I want my teeth to be on this center line. So starting at the very bottom, we're going to do this on the side that we can see the teeth at, so that when we finish, it's the side we don't see the teeth that ends up on the fabric. This is just going to be a very simple basting stitch, just lining up the teeth of the zipper with this quick line that we have drawn from trying it on. And what I should have done is taken a moment to make sure the seam allowance faces down. As I sew over this part, I want the seam allowance of the light green to go into the dark green and of the dark green up top to go down low. So this dark green piece here gets very thick with seam allowance, and that is what we want. Mine has a bit of a sway to the lower back because I have what is considered a sway back, so I need it to come in to form fit to my body properly. Yours could be straight up and down, and that's okay. So what I'm going to do is transfer my marks to the other side, because I only marked one side when I pinned it. And this will give me just a rough guideline of where the zipper should go. So now, if you fold the zipper right way out, so that all your seam allowance gets folded under, you can fold this side under as well, and you can see this is how it wants to connect. It gets a little tricky because you're going to want to try and line up your seam allowances as much as you can so that all your lines line up on the actual garment so that our point actually comes to a point. So I'm just putting a pin on the bottom part. Now I am pinning this the wrong way, and that's so that I can get the zipper all the way down without disturbing it. And I'm going to place, we're going to get the top one in the same position. This might require me to stretch one side over the other. There we go. So now that those two places are pinned, I can unzip this and we can sew this side down. Even just pinning it a bit makes sure that you have the zipper placed right. Invisible zippers can get really tricky to figure out which way they're supposed to be facing. So I find the easiest way to figure that out is to fold it so that you have it. The zipper's not laying correctly. There we go, that's better. And I should have checked the top as well. So this part down here is great, this part is not. And up here it gets a little wonky. I'm going to seam rip it and try it again, because we are going to see it. It is important to take your time here. And sometimes it takes more than one try. And let's see if this is better. Ah, that's much better. I'm going to go back and sew this properly. We're going to sew all the way to the end of the zipper, and then we're going to come back and sew this to itself. So now we put it back to a regular type of stitch. We push teeth out and we sew right beside them. You can't sew on the teeth, the metal part, or else your zipper won't go up. And then we're going to go back and sew up this part to where it connects again. Now I'm trimming my seam allowance so there's not too much left over. And we're going to trim all the way to just below the top of the zipper. And while I'm on this side, I just want to double check that this goes all the way to the zipper. We're going to have to actually unstitch some of this potentially. We shall see. For that to go all the way up, we want this lining to end at the bottom of the zipper. And I went just a touch too far. So I'm going to seam rip that little bit. So we have to hem this front part, the front flap that goes all the way around before we can attach these on. Which requires me to switch back to my regular foot. So for this, we're doing a double fold. I believe we did an inch, so you want to do half an inch, or whatever feels right and will give you the end look of what you want. I like to put a pin in the point so that I can get it over that hump and turn the fabric. I just use it as a fulcrum point. Never sew over your pin. This way it actually goes over that hump of the extra. And our front flap is sewn. On the neck, we're going to slit the seam allowance on the actual neck piece so that this front part can go down. Pin that just where it's open. And on the sides, we're going to fold everything up. Now, a good idea is to get rid of all this extra seam allowance on the inside so that it's a little thinner. And we're going to do what's called stitching in the ditch. So you want to fold down the underside of the collar just past this stitching line, because we're going to stitch all the way along here to attach it together. And we're going to pin it on the other side too. Now, if your zipper comes all the way up, this would be folded in, and all you'd have to do is fold this in like this and stitch all the way around. Because our zipper doesn't come that low or that high, we are going to let this side come out like that, put our snaps here, and have this side be the part that goes over. So that means this needs to be trimmed because it's way too wide. And actually the best way of doing this is to undo some of what we just did, fold it this way, and sew it straight down, and then flip it the other way. Remembering to trim that corner so it'll let us actually flip it. This will need a quick stitch on this part. It wants to fold twice, which is perfect. And that'll give it a nice clean edge that will lay on top of everything. And this side will have something similar, but we'll put it slightly further out because we want a bit of an overlap. So if we have a double fold here, that's actually the right amount, so I don't want to trim anything off. But I do have to sew this, so we're going to as I sewed, I kept this bottom edge up so that when I flip it right side out, it'll still keep the right shape that I want. So we can repin this neckline. I definitely recommend pressing it, like with an iron. ironing it. So now we're going to stitch all the way around the neck, right below where the previous stitching line is, pulling out the pins before we stitch over them. Now when I get to the center, I'm going to do a little U shape, just to make sure that center is stitched down so it doesn't flip up. Next, we're looking here again. We're going to sew the lining to the skirt, and we're going to do this by going inside out and stitching it seam allowance to seam allowance, just all the way across until we get to the zipper. So it's a nice finished seam when we go back. So if you lay it out so you can see the side comes out like this, all you have to do is go in and connect these. And the little bit that's left, we're just going to hand sew. And we might as well do that now, and then it's done. And all I'm doing is going in and out, making sure not to go all the way through the bottom layer, mostly going through just the zipper. And keeping it a little away from the zipper so it doesn't get caught. It's the big thing, you don't want your lining to catch in your zipper as you're zipping everything up and down. There's lots of fancy ways to do this, but you don't have to. I stitch stripped it a little too much. That's okay, we can just stitch it back together by hand. Okay, next up, the snaps. So we're going to do 4 snaps up this way and here to go on top. We're going to do 2 on the bottom part and 2 on the top part. I'm going to use snaps because I find Velcro will catch on the wig, and hooks and eyes can catch on the wig too. So I find snap the easiest to use for something that's going where a wig's going to go. The trick to sewing on snaps is you actually double your thread and put both the beginning and the end through, so that when you get to the other end it's a loop, and then you tie that together so that your thread is actually 4 pieces of string instead of just 2. The other trick is there are 2 sides to a snap. There's a flatter side and there's a rounded side. We're going to put the flat side down, so that's the side that goes against the body and is going to be more comfortable. And all you do is go in and out. I like to go through each loop twice so that we have 8 pieces of thread going through. So when I come down around the final way, I put it underneath and go up through the next hole. And you want your thread nice and snug but not pulling at the fabric. And then at the final time, we just go through and we tie it on the other side. I do a nice double knot, so it's nice and secure. On these ones, we don't have to worry what we're gonna see because this is the inside. So I put them evenly among the bottom spot, and I'm going to put them evenly within the top spot. So this side is where it gets a little tricky. Line everything up, and we're gonna feel exactly where this goes. I like to softly put it on, hold it so it looks right, and then I put my finger between and hold this on this side, so it's gonna sit exactly where we need it to be. We're actually gonna start with the knot in the middle of this fabric, right under the nib. And when you go through the fabric, you only wanna go through this layer so that nothing shows on the back, because that's actually the side that we would see if she had shorter hair. And I'm just giving it one extra swirl around for that starting one. So we went 3 times, and I'm gonna do the same thing that we've been doing before, but when I go through the fabric, I'm making sure not to go all the way through and only go through that top layer. And I'm gonna double loop it at the end because my thread actually came out a little bit. It cut one of the threads because this is so sharp. So now I come back in through that hole and I come right out near this other hole, just going through that one fabric again. We're gonna tie it nice and tight to the bottom, like we always do, double knot. And then the secret to this is you put your fabric through again, through that single layer, and all your extra bits are inside, and you can't see anything from the other side. We're gonna repeat that for the other neck piece. It gets easier once you have one attached, because you can actually hold that in place to find out exactly where the next one's going. And these ones you only have one layer of fabric, so you just want to pick up a tiny couple pieces of that fabric. Just a couple threads instead of going all the way through because there's not that much fabric to go through. Now if you don't mind seeing it, or in the case with Keyleth, because of her hair we're not going to see it, you can just sew all the way through and not worry about it. I'd like the option to do short-haired Keyleth at some point as well. And there you go, there's nothing there to see. And you may only need 1 snap for the neck or 2 snaps because that's how far their zipper goes. This is just how many I needed. I needed 4. This is looking pretty good. This is great with the seam allowance. We're gonna cheat the seam allowance out a bit because I want it to be not quite as in. That's going to be perfect. So the next step is to figure out where these go. Hi, sweetie. You helping? So trying to get these even, or as even as possible. I would say all in all that's sitting the way I want it to. This will still have movement. So I'm just fiddling with it to make it sit the way I want it to. Perfect. And then we're going to pin along here so that it doesn't shift. There we go. So we're actually going to move most of this out of the way so we can start here stitching all the way down and around. across the bottom, and this is just to keep all this extra material where we want it. We could have done this and should have done this before I pinned it. I didn't think of it. And we're just stitching as close to that dark green as we can, but just on the light green. This is called stitching in the ditch. When you do a corner like this, make sure your machine is down, the needle is down, and then just open the foot and move it over. And that just makes sure that the lining doesn't shift so we don't see it. Now what we're going to do is stitch this down all the way across on top of the flap. That's why we pinned it all the way across. We're going to start right here, make sure everything's laying as we had pinned it, and we're going to back tack. We're going to take out all the pins except that one on the very corner and still stitch in the ditch. And I'm going to stitch all the way toward the zipper just to help everything lay the way I want it to lay. Now I'm going to put thread through my needle, tie the ends together, and starting from the back side, right where this is pinned, I'm going to stitch all the way through in where that seam is, move over a bit and put it back into where the seam is so that the thread itself disappears into the seam. There we go, and I've just stitched all the way across, and I'll tie that off on the inside. And we'll do the same for the one on the other side. And now we're going to sew on the armholes. For me, it's easy to know which is the front and which is the back because the front is much shorter. What we want to do is line up the underarm seam so that the good part of your seams are together, like so. It goes all the way around. I'm going to pin the one on the other side at the same time. And if it's easier to remember, it's a bit of a scoop, and the bottom is where it makes like a J shape. And we're just going to sew these down at 1/2 inch at the bottom and less than that at the top because we wanted it to come out a bit when we did our little fitting. Once it's sewn, we're just going to come in and along the curve make little clips into it that go almost all the way to the stitching line, but not quite. And repeat on the other side. So we want to flip everything to the wrong side. Then with the iron, we're going to press that whole seam flat so that the facing lies on the wrong side of the garment or the inside all the way around. I find it easier to do on the ham. Then, on the edge of the facing that's not attached, fold over your seam allowance amount, about 1/2 inch, and press that with the iron down so it gets nice and crisp, and then pin it. And do this all the way around so that there's no raw edges on the actual shoulder anymore. This should all be pinned on the inside of the tunic. And then repeat it on the other side. So now to sew this, we're going to use a single thread, which is where you put your thread through the needle, but you don't tie the ends together. You leave one shorter and one longer, and you tie the longer one. We're going to start at the underarm, and we're going to come through both sides of the fabric that is folded. Then, when we go through the bottom, we're only going to catch the seam allowance there. And then you can go through the fold and catch just the seam allowance and through the fold again. Once you have no more seam allowance, you just want to catch a couple threads of the fabric behind. And then through that fold. And then again, just a couple threads, and you just go back and forth between catching just the edge of that fold and a couple threads underneath, and we're going to do the whole armhole like this and the other one. So at the end, we tie it in a knot. So there are little puckers. Usually once you give it a quick press or an iron, you won't see it. And you just have to do the other side, and it's done. So we're taking 2 long lengths of a strip that's about 1.5 inches wide. Same width we used for our piping. And then making sure this is the inside with the seam. You follow the seam all the way up. Then you place your twill tape on top of the left side of the ribbon, about 1/4 inch in from the edge. Fold over the edge on top of your thin twill tape and stitch that all the way down through the twill tape and 2 sides of the ribbon. This just gives us some bulk to the fabric so that we can sew it into a cord by hand on the next step. Now I'm going to take this to the iron and iron this side over just a little bit. And you'll see why in a minute. So to do this, all we're going to do is roll this side that's got the twill tape in it towards the side with the fold in it. And then we're just going to take our little hand sewing needle and sew all the way down. Here goes nothing. We started with 2 strips of fabric, and fabric is usually 115 or 45 inches, or 60 inches, which is 150 centimeters. Mine was 150, which means that this piece is going to be 3 meters in total. Now that is too much for me. If it is not enough for you, definitely add a 3rd strip and repeat all the previous steps all at once. So you sew them all together first, then sew your piece down so that everything becomes one long piece. The hand stitching takes forever. I'm not going to show all of it, but it is better to have the length of ribbon to be a little too long and we can cut it in the end than it is to have it be too short and be trying to add some after it's all sewn together. Okay, so looking at my reference picture and starting at the center back, which should have a seam. Okay, trying to figure out where this looks right on me versus what looks right on her. She's got an impossible torso that I don't have. Keyleth, in the images that they released, she has a very long torso. And my torso's not that long. Because this is like down here. So I think what I'm gonna do is hand sew it here, here, and here. Leave it loose here so it can shift. Maybe attach it here and here. Yeah. Here and here so it can shift here, but not too much. And then in terms of length, okay, so I'm gonna stitch it everywhere it's pinned in the 5 spots. And I'm going to stitch these here. So to start, we're just gonna, because we took this off with with everything pinned as is, and we're gonna sew this down. I'm starting from the underside, and I'm trying to only catch the underside of this piece of this that we've made. And I just go through 3 times. And we'll repeat that for all the other ones. This is all one continuous piece of thread, which isn't going to work anymore. So what I'm going to do is trim this where I need it. And then, because this is going to come apart, we're just going to re-sew about 1.5 inches with a new thread just to secure it again, and we'll do the same on the other side. Okay, my other little thing that I'm gonna do to help stop this from continuously fraying, because the twill tape that's on the inside is cotton and the outside is silk, I just get a little bit of a singe here. If you have man-made fibers like a polyester or a nylon, it'll get a little goopy. This just chars the edges and really stops it from fraying. A little trick from Lossien. Okay. It's officially done! Woo! So, all in all, I'm fairly happy with the tunic. I wish I had fabric that matched. You can't see much of the back because of all this. There's a tiny crease here from me not being careful enough because I was trying to sew it very fast. And it's comfortable. I occasionally have to pull the sleeves down just a little bit because when I move around, they tend to pop in. Not much you can do about that. I'm very happy with all the colors and everything. I'd say it's a win. Thanks for coming on this journey with me, and I want to see what your Keyleth looks like too. Tag me on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter. Those are the main ones. And I'll see you next time. Hi. Persephone. Hi, sweetie. Hello. I forgot what I was saying.